Hi everyone, it's Lauren Hawker-Zaffer. Welcome back to Redefining AI, the tech podcast. I'm an educator and I'm taking you on an educational exploration into the fascinating minds of those that embody and forefront all you need to know about artificial intelligence, machine learning, insight engines, and the insights era. This episode is called Singapore's Digital Vision. And to discuss this, I've been joined by the accomplished Yeong. Kin is presently the Assistant Chief Executive in the Data Innovation and Protection Group of the Infocomm Media Development Authority of Singapore, the IMDA. As an internationally recognised expert on AI and data, Kin dedicates his professional efforts to developing forward-thinking governance on AI and data, driving a pipeline of AI talent, promoting industry adoption of AI and data analytics, as well as building specific AI and data science capabilities in Singapore. Kin is also recognised for his efforts in spearheading the development of Singapore's Model AI Governance Framework, which won the UN International Telecoms Union WISES Prize in 2019. Kin's AI ethics expertise is prominently recognised internationally, as he is a current member of the OECD network of experts on AI, One AI. In 2019, Kin was a member of the AI group of experts at the OECD AI Go, which developed the OECD principles on AI. These principles were endorsed by the G20 in 2019. He was also an observer participant at the European Commission's high-level expert group on AI, which fulfilled its mandate in June 2020. Now, with such an impressive resume and well-recognised dedication to the field of data and AI, it really is an honour to have King here with us today. King, all the way from Singapore, a warm welcome to Redefining AI. Welcome, King.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. I'm glad to be part of this conversation and I'm looking forward to it.
How are you today? It's really great that you've taken the time to join us, and I'm also looking forward to the conversation. How are things today in Singapore?
It's good. It's a year end, so we're slowing things down a little, catching our breath. It's been a spectacular and breathtaking year. Travel has resumed and we've had a number of events. I'll be keen to talk a bit about some of the things that we launched this year, like the AI Verify minimum viable products, right? So that's keeping us busy. And also the privacy enhancing technology sandbox, which we launched in July as well. So all in all, it's been a breathtaking year and time to slow down a bit, catch our breath, and then get back in January when the new year starts.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it certainly sounds like you've been busy, and we'll look forward to discussing a little bit more about those events and the developments that you've mentioned, especially maybe the privacy enhancing technologies. But let's go back to the start a little, Kin. So my own curiosity leads me firstly to your background. Where did you grow up and what directed you to focus your educational efforts primarily on law and in particular computer and communications law?
Well, in Singapore, when you are young, right, you are either in the science stream in your primary and secondary education or you're in the arts stream. I happen to be in the science stream. So that kind of gave me a predisposition towards technical and scientific areas. Eventually, I decided that I would read law in university, right? At the same time, I picked up computers as a hobby. It was really a hobbyist back then. And we're really talking about, this is just about 1990. So I was putting my computer together, running all kinds of programs, discovering how it works. And then the internet came about, and then I started to go online. Around about that time, I was reading law in Singapore, and there was one particular course. It was called simply the computer law course. And that was how it all started, right? A marriage of law, hobby, right? And this interest in science and technology, right? And that's where the journey began.
Mm-hmm. Is it quite common then in Singapore? I mean, you mentioned that there is a possible streaming or encouragement for science or arts. How does that develop in terms of positive identification with either or in Singapore?
that was the way they kind of like streamed us, right? Based on what they thought we might be good at based on how we perform in the subjects that we learned in school. I would say that one of the benefits of this system is because I was schooled, right, in science, technology, and mathematics, right? When you start looking at areas of law that deals with the protection of technology and the support of technology, it enabled people like myself who grew up through this stream to better understand technology, right? How technology works and how the law can affect it, right? Or how the technology can actually affect the law. So this was actually a very fortunate confluence of education, interest, right, that led me to where I am today. So I style myself as a technology, media, and telecoms lawyer essentially all my life, right? And AI and privacy, data protection is one aspect of this area of practice.
Fascinating. Maybe a point to draw out from that is that you've mentioned the impact of either or sort of technology on law and law or technology. In your opinion, is there one that has an overarching prevalence on what's more impactful, technology on law or law and technology?
Oh, no, I see it as a dance, perhaps. You see, Singapore adopts the common law tradition, right, that came from UK. So a lot of areas of law are very established. So in the area of technology, media, and telecoms law, one of the things that I study actively when I'm not looking at things like AI and pets, right, is how technology influences existing areas of law. Today, the current conversation that has kept us busy is things like NFTs, right? Yeah, NFTs, property. What kind of rights do you have in NFTs? So it's an interaction of how technology has developed and how the law is responding to protect the rights of people who have invested, bought into NFTs, people who have issued NFTs, and people who run those marketplaces or exchanges that deal with NFTs. And then there's the flip side, right? Which is data protection is actually one classic example. When you start collecting personal data into IT systems and you are amassing huge volumes of data, right? Then what new laws do you need to introduce to make sure that individuals' interest in the protection and the use of data are recognized and protected by law? How do you introduce new laws that make it very clear that data controllers have a certain set of obligations to make sure that the quality of data is good, protect the data, right, so that they can use it effectively? So that's the other aspect, where because of new technology enabling certain functions and capabilities in the marketplace, you need new laws, right, to be introduced to deal with it. So I see it as a dance, right? Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful analogy. It leads us on to maybe in our introduction and what we've just touched upon there. We mentioned that you're currently dedicating your professional efforts to developing forward-thinking governance on data and AI, and that you're promoting this industry adoption of AI and data analytics, as well as building specific AI and data science capabilities in Singapore. What can we envision with this as listeners, as an audience? What does this entail?
Yeah, so the focus of my attention these days is really this issue of, as more companies are making use of AI to drive product functionalities, introduce new features that can provide more personalized services, for example, or it can help, make predictions, whether it is for predictive maintenance or recommend a certain scoring of risk, credit risk, right? So that leads to decisions about extension of credits to individuals. As more of that technology comes into the hands of companies and they start using it, how do we take a look at the regulatory regime around the use of data, right? And how data is used to support decision making? How do we look at the regulatory regime around it? And in order to provide that support to organizations so that they are able to use this technology with confidence within the OB markers that have been put in place, right? How these OB markers can give consumers that confidence and that their rights are being taken care of and their interests also taken care of. So that's kind of like the high level view of how we see looking at regulatory frameworks and policies in this area can support the greater adoption of this kind of technology.
Mm-hmm. And is that how you're purposely looking at the regulatory regime there? You're looking at frameworks and policies, the introduction of that to support organizations and consumers?
Yeah, precisely that. And that's actually quite a lot to unpack. You see, first, what is the correct regulatory approach?
Mm-hmm.
We've made an assessment over here, all right? We believe that AI is emergent. So the way it is being used in the industry, we are still at the very early stages. Second, some of the concerns that we have read about in news media, sometimes news media report interesting stories, but it may not actually be widespread. But this discloses an underlying concern for consumers about how data is being used. So we need to find a way to balance it. So the regulatory approach that we want to take is really what I refer to as an agile regulatory approach. What does that actually mean? It means that when you look at regulation, we try to maximize and use the different regulatory options. Regulatory options can range from introduction of new laws, right? Black letter laws, as we call it, which are mandatory obligations you must comply, right? To the other end, which are voluntary frameworks. We started in Singapore for our AI model framework as a purely voluntary framework that companies can choose to adopt, right? By choosing to adopt, you are making a statement that you are complying with these standards without the compulsion, of mandatory law, but you're doing it voluntarily. These are the two bookends, right, of regulatory options. Aligned in between these two bookends, you have different options, right? You can have self-regulation, you can have, certification, right, as different options. So how do we maximize the use of these options, these regulatory options, by picking the right approach that we think will be the best way of supporting the technology at the stage of development and at the stage of industry development and adoption. So for Singapore, we started out looking at model framework, purely voluntary, because we thought that companies are just discovering how to start using AI,
mm-hmm.
right? And start using it at scale. But we hear from the ground, consumers do have some concerns. They are concerned about how their data is being used. So a model framework like this provides a framework that companies can try and voluntarily comply with. And that framework is public, right? I probably will go into a bit of details of the framework later or what the content is. But the idea being that it's there, it's voluntary, they choose to comply with it. And by complying with this voluntarily, they're making a statement, right? And consumers, civil society can take a look at the framework. They can make suggestions to see how we can improve it. So this way, we are able to involve different stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
Put out a draft, organizations use it, give us comments, consumers, civil society give comments, we can improve it, right? And that's another aspect of agile regulation, getting all stakeholders to be part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to mention, actually, it sounds like a very collaborative and comprehensive process that you're trying to embed into the adoption of AI. At the start, you mentioned that you believe it is still emergent, and obviously the bookends that you've highlighted, one that I'm personally curious about is the voluntary frameworks that you've established. How many organizations are actually taking active responsibility in adopting those frameworks?
I would say we won't know for sure because we aren't able to count. They won't tell us. Let me go through a few numbers, right? And these are not exact numbers, but when we first introduced the voluntary model framework, we also wanted to provide useful examples of how, when the framework is implemented in the real world, what those practices might look like. So what we did is we went out, right? And we spoke to companies who are prepared to use our framework, whether in full or in part, because it's voluntary, they can use a certain part of it, and whether they have practices, right, that can be stood up as examples and as illustration of how a certain section of the framework might look like, right, and how they think that they implemented it. We were able to collect real-world examples from companies like Google, Microsoft, Visa, HSBC, DBS, startups like YouCare.ai, even City of Darwin, which is a public sector department from Australia, right? These are some examples. We ended up with 2 volumes of these compendium of use cases. That was 2019. I think the number is probably in the region of about 30 companies back then. Recently, we took the next step and we launched a minimum viable product, which is AI Verify. Very briefly, what AI Verify does is that it takes the framework to the next step. The framework was essentially a document. You can use our self-assessment guide, run through it and see whether you have implemented it. We took the next step by trying to compile, right, a software testing toolkit that can do 2 things: test certain aspects of AI, like fairness, explainability, robustness, and document the other aspects of the AI principles, right? That documents decisions that were made in the model development process and generate a report thereafter.
And I'd certainly like to find out a lot more about that when you have a little bit more information, and it's maybe something that we can pick up in a future episode. We've sort of skipped over, I think, a couple of steps because we mentioned at the start about the IMDA, and you've been working for the IMDA for the past 6 years now, Yeong. And if I am correct, we can say that the IMDA is a statutory board in the Singapore government that does seek to deepen regulatory capabilities, as we've mentioned in the conversation, for a converged Infocomm media sector, and that it does safeguard the interests of, as we mentioned, consumers, as well as fostering pro-enterprise regulations. Now, it is part of a larger mission to really drive Singapore's digital transformation. And one of the things that you mentioned is that this year you've been working on privacy-enhancing technologies. Is that part of the mission that you have set and forefronted to drive the digital transformation of the Singaporean public? Or how did that fall into development, and what does that entail, that project there?
So IMDA, right, we cover a lot, right?
It seems like it, yeah. It seems like you do a lot of wonderful stuff here.
Yeah. And then Infocomm media and also consumers, getting them online and helping them to stay online. So we promote, so there's an industry promotion angle, and then there's also the regulation angle. I do a lot of work where we try to use the policies and regulation to support industry development while protecting the interests of consumers. So one of the things that we are always keeping an eye out for, that my group especially, is data-driven technologies, right? What are the technologies that make use of data, and how are we able to understand, right? See how industry wants to support them, wants to adopt them, and then see what we can do to support the adoption by providing the policy clarity that we can do so. We are able also to pull in other interventions like grant supports, right, other industry development programs into a package. So one of the things that we were looking at coming out, right, of COVID was really what's the next set of technologies beyond AI, right, that's data driven. And lo and behold, privacy enhancing technologies came into focus. This is not the first time that we touched it. I have a funny story to tell. Quite a few years ago, right? This must have been like 3 or 4 years ago. The National Research Foundation in Singapore supported establishment of 2 centers to conduct scientific research in that, right? And then as the head of a group that looks at data innovation and protection, I was approached to say, would you be interested to be part of this? I had no idea what PETS was back then, but I say, hey, is data, is privacy enhancing? The answer must be yes.
Yes.
That kind of started our journey, right? To understand the science. And then a few years later, we introduced this program called the Regulatory Sandbox, right? To support the use of data. And lo and behold, 70-80% of the companies that came into the Regulatory Sandbox wanted to do a few things. One, they wanted to engage in a commercial partnership, but they wanted to discover what's the overlap of their customer database to see whether continued investment in this negotiation was worthwhile, right? Second, they wanted to test technologies, right? New ways of safely inferring attributes from each other's database, but without actually disclosing the data, but in order to create profiles that they can use to better segment customers, better plan their marketing and campaigns. So these business use cases came about, and we supported one or two of them, but using very traditional things like anonymization techniques and trusted third parties. Then COVID came, right? And a lot of this innovative activity kind of got put on the back burner. We were dealing with a crisis. And as we were re-looking at revitalizing this regulatory sandbox, the topic of pets came up from the industry as something that we should be looking at. Started to have conversations and realized that some of the work we did before can be considered part of pets, right? But the science, the technology had developed over the last few years that it can do more. So that's why we thought, okay, when we are revitalizing this regulatory sandbox, let's have a focus on pets. Let's have a focus on 2 or 3 commercial use cases, right? 2 or 3 categories of commercial use cases. And let's see what we can do to achieve a couple of things. One, identify which, because pets is actually an umbrella term for a basket, right, of specific technology. You've heard of things like anonymization is recognized as one. You've got secure multi-party computing, you've got homomorphic encryption, right? You've got differential privacy. So you've got different types of technology that will achieve specific functions. So what's the best matching of the technology, the function it can achieve to the business use case? And then once we have this match, what are the regulatory boundaries that we can provide clarity for at this point in time based on what we know, right? So that, at least once you have that clarity, companies can start using technology to solve those commercial use cases that we are comfortable with. And
sorry to interrupt. Was there similarity in the use cases that you identified or the use cases that you adopted, the commercial use cases, or were they disparate in alignment with the technologies?
So we're still fairly early in the sandbox. We only launched it in July, right? So we focus on 3 areas. The first area is identify common customers, because that is a use case that's come up very often. Second, how do we infer or get additional attributes from 2 different data sets without actually sharing the data or disclosing any of the underlying data? And 3, how do we use privacy enhancing technology to make more data accessible and available for model development and training? So these are the 3 big ones, right? And we are in the process of, we've got one clear application that has been approved, and there was a press release, so I can talk about it. It's really pharmaceutical, right? But we've got a number of the others in the pipeline that have applied to be part of the pilot. I won't be able to disclose them at this point in time, but as and when they enter the pilot and we are able to, we'll share the information.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. I mean, the regulatory sandbox that you have set up as part of the project, were you inspired by anything externally? I mean, we're quite aware that Singapore has ranked highly in Bloomberg's Innovation Index. And I think that there's a lot of strength in its tertiary research institutions, and that's why it has like a burgeoning sort of startup scene. Was this particular project or movement inspired by anything externally, or in the sense of globally, or any other countries I'm engaged in similar activities or research?
Okay, I would say that when we started thinking of regulatory sandbox in IMDA, right, I would say that my inspiration came from our financial regulator, the Monetary Authority of Singapore. They had introduced a regulatory sandbox for fintech, right? Okay. I believe that they might have gotten some inspiration from the UK financial regulator. I'm not very sure about this one, right? So there's a bit of cross-pollination, but definitely when I saw that they were doing it, I thought that we should do something similar as well. The difference being that in financial regulations, you operate a licensing regime. So once you are clear about what policy changes need to be done, you make changes to the licensing conditions, and that's how you get out of the sandbox. So, right? So for us, we don't issue licenses, but we have other instruments like interpretation, practical guidance, advisory guidelines. And of course, there's always the option of making amendments to the law if we are prepared to do so. So we've used a different set of, I would say, policy instruments that we have at our disposal to run this sandbox.
And how do you see that unfolding as well? Because obviously we're thinking about the outcome, what's going to happen like post-assessment in the development of the research. We've mentioned maybe amendments to the law, but how do you expect to marry the developments with society and implement what comes out of the research? What are you thinking about for the future?
Well, I think there are the immediate steps that we can take, right? So the immediate steps that we plan to take at the end of this PETS sandbox is that we made it a condition for being part of this sandbox. Once you've gone through with us, right, we want to do two things. One, publish a case study that details the technology, how it's being used. Of course, we will redact any commercially sensitive information, but a case study so that others can read, understand what was done and how they might be able to do the same. We will also publish together with it a document that we call practical guidance. Essentially, it is a policy document that explains what steps have been taken and why we think that those steps were sufficient, right? And how we intend to interpret our data protection law, right, in this situation and where the policy and regulatory boundaries might be. So we've done some of these in the past, in the first iteration of our sandbox, right? So we want to do the same. So this way, you have a very clear docking, right, of commercial use case and also regulatory guidance. And by providing more examples of this that tackles commercial objectives, right, help companies achieve commercial objectives, we will be able to take those initial first steps, right, in getting this technology into the hands of get the technology out of the lab and into products and into the hands of.
Sounds exciting. Something that I'll definitely have to follow. I think that the role that you've taken on as well, it must come with certain challenges and frustrations, especially in forward-thinking governance of such topics, data, AI. What sort of effect this had on your own alignment with your role in the development of frameworks or?
I would say that it is definitely challenging. Being trained as a lawyer, we are trained to spot the issues, identify the problems, and point it out, right? That's only half the challenge if you want to be a good policy maker and regulator. You need to then move on to solutioning. So that's where the challenge is. And as you solution, right, you need to take care of interest. You need to ensure that you are able to support the innovative use of technology while at the same time taking care of the interests of consumers who will change with time, right? As technology gets into their hands and they become more familiar and comfortable with the technology, the level of acceptance will change, right? But it can also take a wrong deployment, a bad example by a company, right? And then the sentiment might swing the other way. So trying to make sure that we calibrate it just nice, right? It's going to be difficult, but also I say two important things that we need to, that make it all the more challenging. One, having the knowledge, right? Facing the knowledge that you don't know actually very much in this area. The industry knows a lot more, right? So always playing the students, always trying to learn, always having that attitude of humility and the eagerness to learn. The second is also knowing that you might actually be wrong. That's why we use an agile regulatory approach. We use soft options because those are a lot easier to adjust, right? And that's why in the initial stages, we try to marry the policy guidance very closely with the commercial implementation, right? So that we are taking steps incrementally, carefully, supporting the use, and then learning as we go along. As we become a bit more comfortable, then we are able to then abstract from the policy guidance we've given certain principles that we can then promote into a higher order policy instrument like our advisory guidelines. So that's like the overall plan. It's a long road ahead.
I mean, it's certainly a long road ahead. And I think that there's a lot of ambiguity and maybe misalignment and also lack of understanding. And this is something that I'd like to ask you as well. So you've got the angle of trying to support the innovative use of technology, but you've also got the angle of trying to support the interest of consumers or users, because there's a whole ecosystem around that. You've got the ecosystem of trying to ensure that a community or those that are involved in the ecosystem, that there's digital literacy, that there's tech literacy, that there's transparency, that there's confidence, that you've got the right amount, as you said, of regulatory guidance. How do you manage that so well in Singapore? And what advice would you give to other countries that are less able or not as advanced in that development?
we try our best, right? I'm not sure that we'll say that we are a success story to be emulated. We try our best. One of the things we do a lot is involving stakeholders in this as much as we can, internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. We can do it through various methods. I go back to our experience in AI. We can have formal international leaders, right, as part of our AI advisory council. We get a lot of good guidance and inspiration and ideas from them. When we go out, we talk to the companies, right, and get them involved in kicking the tires. We do a close round with them, with close partners. They give us comments. We take it on board. We make changes. We go for open pilots, right? We go for international pilots. So getting these stakeholders on board. And then also including, right, voices that can speak up for consumers in our advisory council so that we are able to hear from them. And very recently, there have been creation of a few civil society groups, right? And we will include them in our consultation going forward as well. So getting these external stakeholders. Internally, in the development of our model framework, there was internal consultation. We don't need to be too formal about it. We gathered together, basically said, okay, AI is coming. We are all regulators in different domains, finance, health, personal data. How do we come together and try to be consistent, standardize on the way of looking at things, standardize on definitions so that we don't confuse the markets, right? The model framework came out. And then after that, one adaptation of it was issued by the Health Sciences Authority for medical devices, right? Our financial regulator had the FEED principles that dock very nicely with ours as well. So that kind of internal collaboration is also very important. And I guess Singapore is a small place. It's a lot easier to come together and talk like this.
Have you revised the model framework often then?
Well, actually, we had a discussion paper. We got input. We had a first edition. Then we got further input. We had a second edition. But since then, we kind of left it, right? You can't be changing the framework all the time, right?
No, of course not.
So we kind of left it there for a while, right? And then we turned our attention to developing the AI Verify MVP.
There's so much more that I'd like to ask you, but we do have to maybe start to usher our discussion to an end, I think, Zikan. There's one maybe more prominent note that we can end on that is a personal note. What do you hope that your own efforts will bring?
A lot of my personal ambition is actually aligned with and rooted into what the organization wants to do, right? I mean, I don't want to sound like your typical bureaucrat and civil servant, but it's true. I believe that sometimes you are placed in a position where we are so that we can do the best and to benefit the most people. I'm fortunate that way, right? And this is an area that matches interest as well as responsibility of work. And basically, in the area of data, use of data, I have benefited from recommendation engines, right? I've discovered new authors that I've liked because Amazon suggested some authors for me. I've discovered new songs that I like because Spotify suggested new artists for me to listen to. So we benefited, right? So how do we ensure that as more companies use this, we are all doing it with the right objective, with the right pace, and with the right sensitivity to ensure that the interests of companies and consumers are aligned. Companies are sophisticated to know that their biggest stakeholder are the customers, right? Yeah. So if the customers are not with them, they don't do well. So making sure that consumer expectation, companies' ambition hit in the same direction, hit at the same pace. How do we provide that policy and regulatory support, right, to ensure that this happens, knowing that these things change with time? How do we play our role there? So actually, yeah, that's actually what I really believe in. And I'm just glad that I'm in a position to be able to support this effort.
We're glad that you're also in that position. I mean, you can see that you have an identifiable both respect and passion for what you're doing. And you've certainly been able to share a wealth of knowledge with us today. I've learned a lot about Singapore, about the digital mindset of Singapore, and also about your efforts as well around ensuring that consumers and customers are kept at the forefront and kept safe. So thank you for that.
But thank you, Lauren, for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts. It's been a very interesting conversation and I really enjoyed it.
I did too. And I'd like to thank everyone else for listening today. If you'd like to find out more about AI, ML and search, go to the Squirrel Academy at learn.squirrel.com. Thank you.